Welcome, dear listeners, to the Carolina Hates podcast, brought to you by Wreak Havoc Productions and A Darker World. I'm your host, Dan Sellers. America rang in the new year in 1781, seeing the Revolutionary War dragging on into its fifth year, with no end in sight. There were two campaigns of the war, the North and the South. General Sir Henry Clinton led the British against General George Washington in the North, while British General Charles Cornwallis focused on South Carolina and Georgia in the South. Opposed by General Horatio Gates, the British forces intended to dominate their respective region and then start expanding toward one another, and it seemed to be working. January 1781 saw New York City under British control. They also held the key port cities of Savannah and Charleston, along with large portions of both states. As the year 1780 came to a close, General Cornwallis was beginning to expand his assault into North Carolina. This forced George Washington to appoint General Nathaniel Greene to replace Gates in the South. The British forces in the South outnumbered the army Greene took over 3-1. The Brits were also better trained and held the strategic advantage. Obviously, whatever Gates had been doing wasn't working, so Greene switched tactics. The smaller size of his army gave him one advantage over the British: speed. He led the Continental Army in retreat. Cornwallis smelled blood in the water and gave chase. Greene's 1,900 men could have easily outpaced their 6,000-man opponent, but he didn't want to. They went just fast enough to allow Cornwallis to continue the chase, while launching several guerrilla-style raids against the British along the way. Furthermore, the British forces had to work much harder to keep up. As the weeks passed, they showed signs of severe exhaustion. Lord Cornwallis was an arrogant and ruthless leader. He cared as little about his own men as he did the enemy. They were simply a means to an end. All he cared about was achieving victory and the political favors it would guarantee him back in England. This pushed him to succeed by any means necessary. In an effort to speed up his forces, he decided they should lighten their load. He ordered all non-essential provisions to be burned. This didn't have the desired result. In fact, it completely backfired. Not only did it not speed up his exhausted troops, but once Greene learned what Cornwallis had done, he orchestrated attacks against the British supply lines, so Cornwallis struggled to replenish the supplies he had abandoned. The cat-and-mouse game went on for about 3 months before Cornwallis gave up the chase and marched back towards South Carolina to regroup. Along the way, he made camp near a place called Crotts Crossing along Abbott's Creek in Davidson County. While there, he received word that Greene was camped at the Guilford County Courthouse in Cape Fear, North Carolina. Finally, he saw an opportunity to get ahead of the Continental forces. There's a legend in Abbott's Creek that, in order to lighten his load even more than he already had, Cornwallis dumped barrels of gold and silver onto the creek. He left a couple of men behind to guard the treasure and set off due east for the courthouse. Little did he know that Greene was at the courthouse devising a defense against Cornwallis's attack. He had also reinforced his army with troops from Virginia, Maryland, and the North Carolina militia. His men now far outnumbered the British troops. Plus, they had almost a week to fortify their position before Cornwallis arrived. Cornwallis arrived just outside of town on March 14th. If he had marched through the night, he could have attacked at dawn, giving him the element of surprise. But instead, they camped along the deep river. He set off the morning of the 15th, without even allowing his men the opportunity to eat breakfast. He reached the first line of Greene's defense just at noon. The British marched through vast farmlands about 1.5 miles from the courthouse. At the edge of the fields, the roads narrowed as it went through a dense, natural wooded area between the plantations and the courthouse. Along the edge of the fields, Greene had set up the first of 3 lines of defense. Each successive line was manned by increasingly better trained troops. This first line was a natural pinch point, created where the road cut through a strip of dense forest almost a mile deep. The edge of the wood line was fortified by a fence the farmers had built at the edge of the fields. Behind the fence, North Carolina's militia waited for Cornwallis, along with 2 6-pound cannons set up on each side of the entrance to the woods. Now, Nathaniel Greene had never fought alongside the North Carolina militia, which meant he had no idea what they would do once the fighting started. They may stand strong, or they might turn tail and run. All he asked of them was to get off 2 rounds with the cannons. This would engage the British in the fight, requiring them to slow down. And it would also give the next 2 lines fair warning of the British advance. However, much to everyone's surprise, the North Carolina militia did hold strong. Very strong. They held the line for nearly an hour, firing volley after volley of cannon fire at the British before, finally, being forced to fall back. Cornwallis pushed forward. His map showed him that the forest was only about 1 mile deep, opening up into a 1,000-acre clearing where the courthouse stood. But Greene had other plans. The second line of defense was in the woods, where the dense undergrowth rendered the British mounted cavalry useless. It also thwarted the use of bayonets. The fighting here was hand-to-hand, face-to-face, and very bloody. It was around 2:15 before Cornwallis and his men emerged into the courthouse clearing. There, General Nathaniel Greene waited for him with the strongest of his troops. The fighting raged on into the afternoon, with neither side gaining a clear advantage. Cornwallis had underestimated the American resolve. He had assumed that General Gates's replacement would be less capable than he had been. He had assumed that taking Governor North Carolina would be a cakewalk, and he was wrong. In fact, he later reported that, quote, "I never saw such fighting since God made me. The Americans fought like demons," end quote. A desperate Cornwallis ordered that grape shot be fired into the mass of soldiers. Grape shot is a burlap sack filled with silverware, rocks, bits of scrap metal, anything they could find at hand. When fired from a cannon, the burlap shreds open, scattering the contents over a wide area, essentially turning the cannon into a giant shotgun. Cornwallis knew this tactic was barbaric and would kill as many of his own men as it would the enemy. But he didn't care. Eventually, Greene's forces began to give in to the more experienced, better equipped British. The Continental Army retreated in defeat. This time, Cornwallis did not chase Greene. He was glad for the respite. It did not feel like victory, though. 800 men lay dead or wounded before him, and almost 70% of them were British. He had lost nearly 30% of his army to the American 6% total loss. No, he did not feel victorious, but he did feel lucky. His men worked late into the night to bury the dead in several unmarked graves. When the sun finally rose on March 16, 1781, Cornwallis marched on, abandoning his wounded. We'll get back to the fates of Nathaniel Greene and Charles Cornwallis in a few minutes, but this is Carolina Haynes, and luckily for us, Cornwallis left a bit of paranormal activity and legend in his wake. According to legend, Cornwallis never returned to retrieve the barrels of treasure that he had hid in Abbott's Creek, and that they remain there to this very day. Several modern-day witnesses have reported hearing the sounds of heavy barrels rolling down the banks and splashing into the water, even though nothing can be seen. Other reports are that balls of light travel up and down the banks of the creek, then ultimately into the woods. It's said that these lights mirror the path taken by Cornwallis and his troops when they camped here over 240 years ago. Some also claim that the reason the treasure still remains there today is because the soldiers Cornwallis left behind to guard it are still doing their jobs. During the Civil War, a man walking through the area found his way blocked by an oddly dressed stranger. The stranger mirrored any attempt the man made to walk around him, adamant on blocking his passage. The stranger refused to speak when the man confronted him. Finally, the man lost his patience and swung a hammer at the stranger. And still the stranger did not budge as the shaft of the hammer passed right through his body. As you may imagine, the man was stunned and claimed the stranger gave him a bone-chilling, devilish grin before fading from sight. The site of the battlefield itself is now called the Guilford Courthouse National Military Park, and the fighting there also left behind some reported ghosts. And they are among the most tangible spirits in the region. It's not unusual for someone to have an interaction with someone at the site and not realize until later that they were talking to a spirit. And I'm sure some people have gone about their day without ever knowing it. There was a man who walked the battlefield area nearly every day. One of these days, he saw a man in a period uniform, which was not all that unusual. Reenactments of the battle are held every March, but it wasn't March, and the man hadn't heard of any events going on at the time. He spoke to the soldier, commenting that it was perfect weather for a reenactment, and hoping there was a good turnout. The stranger gave him a curious look, but didn't reply. He spoke to the man for a couple of minutes, but soon realized that he wasn't going to answer. He shrugged, and they went their separate ways. After just a few steps, the man looked back, only to find the soldier was nowhere in sight. He asked a park employee about any reenactment, but was told there were no events scheduled on that day. Back in the 60s and 70s, nearby residents often called the park to complain about how much noises the horses were making. They could hear horses galloping and neighing throughout the night, and occasionally even make out the yells of the riders. The park explained that they do not allow horses to be ridden overnight, and that they've never housed horses on site. There are no stables at the park. The police investigated. They found no horses, nor did they find any telltale signs of evidence. One woman was helping out during one of the annual reenactments, acting as a support member to the battle. She would act as cook, nurse, or any other non-combat duty. During a quiet moment in the fighting, she noticed a British soldier walk into the camp and take a seat by the fire. He looked quite sad. After a few minutes, she went over and sat with him. They talked, but the man mostly gave simple yes or no answers. She asked him if he wanted any tea, which he gratefully accepted. She turned to get some tea bags from the tea chest, but when she turned back, the man was gone. When the other reenactors returned, she asked about the man but was told there had been no British troops in that part of the park. She described him, but no one claimed to know who he may have been. They showed her some pictures, and she identified the uniform as being the British 33rd, which was General Cornwallis's regiment. Other, less dramatic activity has also been reported. The smell of spent gunpowder, cold spots, bagpipes. A regiment of Scottish Highlanders were entrenched with the British forces. Several of the buildings on the park grounds have reported hearing footsteps or finding items being moved. Joseph Moorhead was a well-known Confederate officer and lawyer from the area. In a letter written to him in 1894, J.H. Foster states, quote, "For years I dreaded to cross the old battlefield, for the people had filled me with hobgoblins, and had seen some of the light horse riding pell-mell without any head, and seeing the lights on the trenches where the soldiers were buried." End quote. Now, if you're wondering about the fate of old Nathaniel Greene, it kind of sounds like he should be forgotten as a footnote to history. 1. He takes over an army. 2. He immediately retreats. And 3. When he finally does take a stand, it ends in bitter defeat. The first 4 months of 1781 make him look like quite the loser. However, he had been associated with many victories in the North before being assigned to command the Southern forces. Furthermore, after his retreat from the courthouse, he led his men south and freed Charleston and Savannah from British control. Meanwhile, Cornwallis also switched tactics and never returned to South Carolina. Some think he feared to return, unwilling to have another confrontation with Greene. He mounted an unsuccessful siege on Wilmington, and then slithered north to Virginia, where he encountered General George Washington at Yorktown. Washington beat Cornwallis into complete submission, which struck a heavy blow to the British invasion. Most experts agree that the surrender of Cornwallis marked the beginning of the end of the Revolutionary War. Washington was close friends with Nathaniel Greene and had complete faith in his ability to command the South. In fact, Washington made the recommendation to Congress that, should he fall in battle, Greene should replace him as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. You may have guessed by now that the town of Cape Fear, where the battle took place, is now called Greensboro. It was renamed in honor of Nathaniel Greene, but it isn't alone. So was Greenville, North Carolina, and Greenville, South Carolina, and, well, there are 21 cities and counties in 18 states that all bear the name of Greene, stretching from Alabama all the way up to Maine. There's also a dozen schools, bridges, parks, rivers, and 4 United States Navy ships named after him as well. In fact, if it's east of the Mississippi and has the word Greene in it, then chances are better than good that you know its origin. As I said, a portion of the courthouse battlefield is preserved today as the Guilford Courthouse National Military Park in Greensboro. But it's a fraction of its original size. Only a couple hundred acres remain. The other 800 have been claimed by apartment complexes and residential neighborhoods. But very few of the bodies were moved because no one knew exactly where they were. Somewhere under the streets of Greensboro, hundreds of fallen soldiers lay in unmarked graves. To learn more about this story, check out Haunted Historic Greensboro by Teresa Bain. There's also North Carolina's Haunted 100 Volume 2, Piedmont Phantoms by Daniel Barefoot. This episode was researched and written by Jeffrey Cochran. It was produced and hosted by me, Dan Sellers. You can find everything that Jeff's up to at his company at adarkerworld.com. You can find everything that I'm up to at recavitproductions.com. We're on Instagram at recavitproductions, and I'm on Twitter at Hank vs. the Undead. To learn how you might support this show and our other endeavors, check out our Patreon page at patreon.com/wreakhavoc. Be sure to like the official Facebook page at facebook.com/Carolina Haints. To learn more about this show and the upcoming Carolina Haints book, visit our website, carolinahaints.com. You can stream every episode of this show directly from the feed at carolinahaints.libsyn.com, or you can subscribe to iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and YouTube. Feel free to email me, recavitproductions@gmail.com. And last but not least, leave us a review and share it with your friends. We love when new listeners find the show. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Tune in then to hear more about the things that go bump in the night.